This is a sequence of poses for strengthening and stretching the muscles of the legs and the hips. We'll take about 25 minutes. We'll start with a warm-up on the floor into our chakra vakasana, so we can do cat and cow. Hands lined up underneath our shoulders, knees, and hips in alignment with the feet straight back. We always move from the lowest part of the spine, so as we go into our cat pose, we're going to pull up the belly as the tailbone drops. We're going to stretch that spine high to the sky, and lastly, roll our chin into our chest. As we switch to our cow pose, we're going to start working with the tailbone, drop the belly, open the heart and the shoulders, lift the chin. Moving back into our cat. Thinking about moving from the tailbone first and really arching the back high to the sky like that cat on Halloween. As we come into our cow face pose, sacral, lumbar, thoracic, cervical spine, move in that order. We're trying to make this like a wave motion, articulating each vertebra as we come from the bottom to the top, helping with arthritis, pain in the back, whatever else might be bothering us today. Now we're going to switch to a down dog. We're going to walk our hands at least one hand length in front, lining up the middle finger with the middle of our shoulders, starfish hands. We're going to roll our chin into our chest as we turn the toes under, lift the knees. And we're trying to get an inverted V as straight as possible from our hands up to our tailbone. So we think about pushing our heart back toward our thighs, our shoulders down toward our toes, feet close enough so that we can push through the heels, that we're not up on the toes. We could lift the toes off the floor without feeling the least bit unstable. We want to get pushing through the heels, getting the stretch through the ankles, the Achilles tendon, the arches of the feet. And then we're going to lift our right leg into our one-legged down dog. Adho Mukha Svanasana Ekapada with the one-legged. And we stretch as high as we can to the sky, keeping the spine straight, and then externally rotating that leg. We're going to pull the knee out to the side as we bring the foot across our hip before we swing it down to the floor behind our right hand. We're going to drop the left knee behind that right ankle. And we're going to see if we can leverage those two legs together to see if we can get a little bit more external rotation on that right leg. Then we'll start dropping torso closer to the floor as we slowly push that straight leg behind us. We're tightening the abdominals as we come down, trying to get our torso as low as we can in toward our leg. If we're tight today, we can stack fist over fist, letting our forehead rest on our hands. Or if we prefer, we can bring our forearms to the floor or stretch our arms straight out in front of us, come even lower into the pose. Tuning into our breath, working with our breath to get deeper and deeper. And thinking about the muscles being stretched in this case. The piriformis lies under the gluteus maximus. It's the one that's on top of the sciatic nerve. So keeping it flexible helps us avoid sciatica. Two muscles that come from that bony part of our hip, the iliac crest, one of them is the tensor fascia lata, that hooks up at the side of the thigh into our IT band. We want to keep that flexible as we do the sartorius that comes from the same point, comes up over the top of our thigh and down below the knee on the inside of the leg. Now we're going to move back into our down dog so we can do the other side. We get our hands on the floor for stability, slide our knees back together, and start all over again. Hands forward, starfish hands, lining up with our shoulders. Toes turn under as we roll our chin in toward our chest. And then lifting the knees. Feet close enough so that we can be at least on the ball of the foot, pushing down through the heels. Shoulders down toward our toes, heart toward our knees, so that we can get that nice straight line from hands to tailbone, pushing that tailbone higher to the sky. One-legged, Ekapada Adho Mukha Svanasana. Using the left leg this time, stretching as tall as we can, pressing through both hands so we don't start dropping one shoulder more than the other. And then externally rotating that leg, bringing the foot over opposite hip, swinging it down to the floor behind our hand, leveraging ankle against knee to see if we can rotate some more before we start dropping closer and closer into the floor. And again, we'll adjust this position as we need to, maybe coming up a little bit higher, maybe stacking fist over fist, maybe stretching our arms straight out in front of us. We're actively working on tightening the abdominals, trying to get ourselves lower into the floor without losing the alignment of the hips and shoulders parallel to the floor. Careful that we're not dropping hip on either side. Tuning into our breath. Working with our breath to see if we can maybe slide the long leg back. And then coming up, getting ready for yet another down dog. We'll slide the knees together. Hands forward again. And as we lift, we'll think about pulling the outer edges of the collarbone up toward the top of our ears to get a little more stretch through the back. And then bringing our left foot forward, getting ready to come into our Warrior One, Virabhadrasana Eka. We're going to make sure that front knee and ankle are in alignment, that the back foot is planted firmly on the floor, the heel, the outer edge, turned at an angle, with the heel toward the back side of the mat and the toe toward the front on the right. We're going to stand up tall, tightening pelvic floor. We're checking to make sure that we feel stable. More important than how deeply the bend in the knee is, we line up our midline with the inside of that front leg, making sure the knee's right over the ankle, that we can see the big toe on that front leg. We can bring our hands together, index pointed up to the sky in our Jupiter Mudra, breaking through barriers. As we stretch the hands above, we can tilt our head back into our stargazer for a little more challenge to our balance. And then bringing those hands down, we're going to come into our Warrior Two. So we rotate around to the side, lining up hips and shoulders with the long side of our mat. We can see if we can drop a little bit lower into the ground, but making sure that knee doesn't start twisting out toward our midline. Shoulders are stacked right over the hips, and then we stretch arms forward and back parallel to the floor. And again, thinking about working with our breath, trying to drop a little bit lower, but always making sure that we don't push that knee out beyond the foot, causing any strain to the knee. And then taking this to a balancing pose, our Ardha Chandrasana, our balancing half moon. We're going to put our weight forward onto our front leg. We're going to bring that hand down to the floor, further out to the side, further forward, so that as we shift our weight, we've got a good balance between hand and balancing leg. We keep ourselves turned to the side. We stack shoulder over shoulder before we think about lifting that hand. It only follows the shoulder. We think about flexing through that back foot. We're trying to use our core strength to lift up tall so we get the sense of flying, maybe bringing our back heel even with our hips. Tuning into our breath, energizing into the balancing foot, and then slowly down to the floor. Coming up and standing tall, we're going to get our feet stable, maybe walking them further apart as we go into our standing straddle. We'll gently take our time getting the legs as far apart as we can feel stable and balanced, but making sure that the feet are aligned either straight forward or slightly inward. We don't want the toes pointed outward. That causes too much strain on the knee. And then we think about tightening the quadriceps so we can stretch more through the hamstrings as we do our pelvic tilt. Leading with the iliac crest down, tailbone moves up behind us. We take our time enjoying the journey, come about halfway into the pose, decide whether or not we want the feet further apart. And then if we think we want to come even further down, starting to bend through the elbows, lowering the torso by tightening the abdominals, making sure, however, that we're not pulling the hips out of alignment with the feet. As we come down, we're taking our time to make sure that we are not going to go beyond that wall, that point beyond which we are going to start feeling any pain or strain. Some of us might be easily able to get our forearms on the floor. Some of us maybe even get the crown of the head on the floor. We will go where our body says it can go at this point in time. Feeling stable, feeling secure. And then walking our hands back underneath our shoulders. We'll heel and toe our feet a little bit closer together so we get to the same distance between as we did with our warrior one before, so that we can rotate it to the opposite side. Hands come out to the side rather than straight forward so we don't put any strain on our lower back. And then we'll move in the opposite direction. So this time it's going to be the right foot coming around directly toward the front, back foot's turned at an angle. We're twisting through the hips, the shoulders, so that we have the midline of the body lining up with the inside of the front leg. Anjali Mudra, hands at heart center, or Jupiter Mudra, bringing hands up if we choose, tilting our head back to gaze between our hands if we choose. Pressing into that back foot, making sure that heel never leaves the floor. The outer edge stays well grounded. Hips nice and neutral, not tucking the tailbone forward. And then going into our warrior two, we bring our hands to heart center, slowly rotate around, making sure that front knee stays in alignment, that we don't drag it forward toward our midline as we turn. Hips and shoulders in alignment, we drop a little lower into the ground, maybe widening the feet a little further apart so we can get a little more stretch on that front leg. Maybe moving back and forth until we find that ultimate point. And then stretching arms forward and back. We're building up bone density, strengthening muscles in the legs, the hips, building strength around the knees and the ankles, but we're also working the arms, so we're pushing as hard as we can, fingertip to fingertip. Feeling that strength flowing through the elbows. And then into our balancing half moon. So we shift our weight forward as we straighten our front leg. Finding our stability in our standing pose before we bring that hand down to the ground. And we can play around with this, maybe just gently lift that back leg. If that doesn't feel like a good balancing point, we'll come out and readjust. But again, we're looking at shoulder stacked over shoulder, getting the shoulders in place. We're thinking about using the core strength so that we feel free, open, bottom hand might be even lifted off the floor slightly or gently touching. And then coming out of the pose, we'll plant both feet on the floor, slowly come to a standing pose. We're going into another squatting position, feet wider apart, comfortable distance, but we want this time to be dropping the hips and having the knees come over the middle of the toes. So we're going to test it out, making sure that's true. If not, we're going to open the toes wider or closer together until we get that alignment that we want through the feet. We'll bring our hands to heart center and gently come down. If we're feeling a little bit tight today, especially through the hips, the inner thighs, we can just put our hands on our thigh and come down not quite so far. But if we can, we're going to come down far enough to get our elbows on the inside of the thigh to leverage those arms against the inner thigh and see if we can get a little bit more stretch. If we're starting to feel fatigued in the pose, we put our hands on our thigh, come up a little bit higher, maybe moving up and down if we feel especially tight today. And then planting our hands on the floor, we're going to come down into frog. We want our knees outside our hip. This is a lot of work on the knees, so if it feels uncomfortable, we're going to bring the knees closer together or we're going to keep our feet in alignment. Otherwise, we're going to turn our feet so the toes are toward the outside, 90-degree angle in the feet before we drop down on our elbows. And then slowly move the hips closer and closer to the floor. Increasing that stretch on the adductor muscles on the inner thigh, across the back of the hips. Watching to make sure that we have no pain, no strain, especially around the knees. Tuning into our breath. And then planting our hands on the floor, pushing ourselves up so that we can swing around to a seated pose. We want to make sure both sit bones are flat on the ground. We want to continue to loosen up through the hip joint, so we're going to do a little bit of cradle the baby. Depending upon our flexibility, we can take both hands underneath our shin, or we can take our one hand, our left hand, to our right foot, wrapping the right arm around the outside of the leg. Or if we feel loose enough today, we can even put that foot in the crook of our elbow. We can rock the baby in the cradle, trying to bring a little bit more motion out to either side. Or we can bring our right arm forward so we can pull the entire leg closer in toward our rib, our shoulder, give the baby a tighter hug so that we can stretch more of the muscles that we did when we did our pigeon pose, our kapotasana. Tuning into our breath, pulling shoulder blades together, and then switching to the opposite leg. So same grip, whatever suits. And again, we have the choice of rocking the baby in the cradle or giving the baby a tighter hug. Regardless, we're pulling our shoulder blades down toward our waistline, in toward our spine, that retraction and depression that keeps our back strong and safe. And then we'll come into our butterfly, our Baddha Konasana pose. So we bring the soles of the feet as tight as we can together, our heels as close as we can in toward our sit bone. We can do some butterfly wings to loosen up a little bit more before we go into a back bend. We want to make sure both sit bones are on the ground. Our spine is nice and tall again. We can think about taking our hand externally, rotating it with the thumb toward the outside, back behind our hips so we don't have to lean backward. And then do the arching by moving the iliac crest up and back in the same direction as our shoulders. We're pushing upward through the heart, thinking about zipping from our pubic bone to our navel, to our solar plexus, to our heart. Watching the bend in the neck, making sure that we're not compressing our cervical spine as we lift up tall. Breathing easily, deeply. And then sitting up, we're going to stretch out our legs. We're making sure we're seated on both sit bones. We're thinking about pushing through the heels of the feet, so we're still keeping active work into the muscles of the legs, even in a seated position. We're thinking about tightening the quadriceps so the hamstrings are pushing closer to the floor. We again think about keeping that scapular depression and as we bring our hands down to the floor in front of us. We're going to take this to a pelvic tilt. So the iliac crest is going to come forward in the direction our shoulders are moving. Our tailbone moves behind us. Taking our time, enjoying the journey, recognizing that the slower we move, the more the muscles relax, the greater flexibility we develop. We can bring our hands out toward our feet if we feel that we can get a little bit lower that way, or we can keep walking our hands straight forward. And again, it's abdominal work, quadriceps tightening as we try and lower it deeper and deeper into the ground. Any yoga pose is always a dynamic pose. It's never static. It never stays where we first land. And now we're going to move down to the floor. So we're going to grab onto the backs of our thighs, making sure when we come down that our spine is nice and straight, that our hips are aligned with our shoulders. We're going to pull our knees in toward our chest. We can hold on to the backs of the legs or the shins. But again, it's the abdominals and the quads tightening up as we stretch hamstrings, muscles across the glutes. And try and get those knees as tight as we can in toward our chest. We're going into our dead bug. So we're going to keep the same position except moving the right knee out to the right and the left knee out to the left, as wide as we can outside our hips. Feet come directly over the knees now. We're trying not to let the heels drop down toward our tailbone. We can change our grip, holding on with our fingertips, 2 fingers and a thumb around the big toe. We're holding on to the outside edges of the feet. But we're still trying to think about the back flat into the floor. Shoulder blades are pulling down into the ground. Our waistline is pushing down into the ground. We're trying to get as much of that spine down so we feel that pressure against our back, massaging it as we hold the position. And then dropping one foot to the floor. We're going to go into our eye of the needle so we keep the left leg externally rotated as far as we can. We reach with the left hand between our legs, the right hand either just holding onto the outside of the right leg, coming behind the upper leg, or all the way to our shin. We're actively working the muscles on that left leg, the glutes in particular, the other ones that will get that external rotation. But at the same time, we're tightening the quadricep on that right leg, tightening our abdominals to see if we can use the strength of those muscles to pull the entire left leg closer toward our body. This is giving us much the same stretch as we got in our pigeon, our Kapotasana, but now starting with a different position. Flat on our back, dropping that foot to the floor, stretching that leg tall to the sky, pushing through the heel so we can still get all of the muscles of the leg stretching, all the way through the ankle and the knee. Trying to pull an entire leg closer in toward our head. We leave at least a micro bend in the knee. We can straighten out the right leg to get a little more stretch through the hip flexor. Now we're going to work on strengthening the muscles on the outside of the leg, stretching on the inside. So we can either hold onto our toe if our arms are long enough, hold onto the side of our leg, or even grab a band. We're going to take our right hand out from our shoulder as we slowly lower the left leg to the floor. How far down we come matters less than keeping that back straight, making sure we don't twist through the spine. So we actively work the muscles on the right shoulder, the right hip, making sure that we keep both left and right shoulder, left and right hips down on the ground. We take our time coming down again, and then bringing that foot high to the sky. We're going to drop the foot all the way to the floor, as tight as we can in toward our right leg. We're going to take our left hand straight out from our shoulder this time and bring the right hand across our body. And we try to pull that knee as close as we can down to the floor, rolling on the side of the hip, thinking about using the adductor muscles on the inside of the thigh to increase that stretch. At the same time, we're working the muscles on the upper shoulder on the left side to keep that shoulder flat into the floor, trying to get a little bit more of a diagonal twist across the torso. Tuning into our breath. Thinking about releasing toxins in our internal organs. Then we'll come back to center and switch to the other side. We lift that leg. Again, whatever grip suits, we can use a band around the sole of the foot. But we're trying to stretch the muscles on the entire back of the leg, so we flex the foot. We keep the leg straight with a micro bend. We keep shoulders and hips on the floor. We can straighten out the left leg if we'd like, or leave it bent as we choose. And then again, grip of choice, band, hand, or even bringing our right arm out to the side, elbow on the floor, so we can use that as support for that right leg as we slowly lower it out to the side. And again, taking the time allows greater flexibility and range of motion, but it also allows us to find that point beyond which we should not go. We check to make sure that the left hip and shoulder never leave the floor. If they do, we start bringing that foot up a little higher. We still try to flex through both feet to continue working the muscles on the leg. And then bringing that leg up, dropping the foot to the floor as tight as we can in toward our left leg. Right hand comes out to the side as the left comes across our body. And we roll over on toward our left hip as we bring that leg around. We work the muscles on the legs and the hips to get that turn of the lower torso into the floor. At the same time, we work the muscles of the upper body to keep moving in toward our right arm, our right shoulder, bringing fresh blood and oxygen to our internal organs, releasing stress in the spine, the hips, and the shoulders. And then coming back to center. We'll make sure our spine is nicely aligned, pressing into our feet and adjusting our hips as needed. And then we can decide, do we want to go to a resting pose, straightening out our legs to come into corpse pose? Do we want to plant our feet on the floor, bringing our knees together? Would we prefer to come out of our resting pose, come up to a seated position, and then decide maybe to do another set of poses as well?